Welcome to the third in our lecture series on the biblical roots of Catholic social thought. In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the book of Samuel and more specifically at this theme of God being king, which the book of Samuel and as well as other books in the Bible focus on. And in Samuel, just as in Exodus, we learned in the last lecture that God is upending the expectations of human social structures and bringing down the wealthy and powerful and lifting up the lowly. We learn again in Samuel that God does not like human structures of hierarchy and dominance. First and second Samuel together comprise the story of the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. Oddly enough, God is against the idea of the kingdom from the very start. God even curses the first king, Saul, and dooms his rule and his descendants. From the divine perspective, God should be Israel's one and only king. If Israel raises up a human king, then Israel will be heteronymous, therefore, ruled by two distinct wills. And God, in the first book of Samuel especially, is constantly railing against the Israelites for desiring a king and for their justifications and their rationale for wanting a king, and saying, you do not need a king, I am your king. And God argues, either I am your king, and I occasionally raise up charismatic leaders to deliver Israel, or Israel raises up a human king and God becomes like an alien to the people. Of course, Israel chooses to raise up a king in spite of God's resistance. We know the stories, of course, ultimately end up in David becoming king and Solomon, his son, making it a great kingdom. However, the human king, at this point, Israel is just thinking about, having a king. And Israel eventually comes up with the rationale that the human king will be God's agent on earth. But still, God's not happy. God's not happy with that rationale. As God's agent, the king must behave as God behaves. That is, the king must advocate for the poor and the outcast and do other things that are God-like. Of course, the human king almost always falls short of this great expectation and fails miserably. And for evidence of that, of course, all you need to do is read the books of Kings in the Old Testament to realize that there are no kings that actually live up to that idea of being God's agent on earth. Ultimately, there are two social structures at work in Samuel, and these two social structures are in so many ways in competition with one another. Ultimately, the one wins out over the other, but initially, God is king. And so the people are all equal to one another. There's no real hierarchy here. You can see this in the book of Judges and Joshua that precede Samuel, that God raises up deliverers, and that God has this very direct relationship with the people. There are no intermediaries, there is no hierarchy. On the other hand, there's the situation where God is king, where you've got a hierarchy established, with a king at the top of the hierarchy. And then you have, of course, a royal court, you have the people, and suddenly you have this class of people in their society known as the poor. And they, of course, occupy the bottom rungs of this hierarchy. In this case, of course, God is a much smaller and possibly a much more marginalized role in Israeli society. And God's relationship is primarily with the king. The king becomes an intermediary. The king is, of course, cast as God's agent. The rest of us have a relationship to the king, and the king has a relationship to God that is special. The rest of us, well, we might have a relationship with God, but it is less meaningful, less important, less consequential than that primary relationship between God and the king. All in all, the story of Samuel is telling us that God is in favor of the relationship that we see on the left, the one in which God is clearly the one and only king, and God has this direct relationship with the people. Human beings have certain human beings have interfered with this relationship, creating a hierarchy in which only certain human beings have a special relationship with God and have become intermediaries. This is something that we will see again and again in Scripture. God is always looking to undermine.